everyone. As you can probably see from the title of this episode, we are going to be discussing AI, and for that, what I have done is I have created an AI-generated Dr. Matt Lauder to replace the labor of the real Dr. Matt Lauder. So I'm just going to open up and say like, AI Matt, how are you doing? I'm very good, Tom. Do you know that tattoos are a medium and not a phenomenon?
It's funny how I've developed an Irish accent. You tune the training data.
Yeah, unfortunately, the training data was the mixed down version of the episode, so it includes there's an AI godhead that is a mishmash of both me and you.
There is one of the built-in features of Gemini is create me a podcast of this document. We could just do that. We could just take the day off. Like, you could definitely train some kind of model on our voices, and we could just take the day off.
Yeah, we could just like create a prompt and input it, and then, I mean, to be honest, there is quite a lot of podcasts out there that would be better served if they were just made by a machine.
Did you see that project? I think it was James Ball, the journalist, who made it. Basically, created a little Python script that took like news headlines from a variety of news sources, and then basically created an AI like permanent talk radio pundit station. And it's just really bleak because it's just basically like these two disembodied voices basically sort of saying, well, Donald Trump's got some very difficult decisions to make. Yeah, I know, but what if he doesn't have difficult decisions to make? Like, just endlessly on repeat, like a fucking hellscape.
With that in mind, you're very welcome to Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything, told through the history of tattooing. I'm a person who has never used a generative large language AI model in my work, and abhor them completely. I am one of your co-hosts, Thomas O'Mahony, and I am joined, as ever, by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder.
So, yeah, much to my chagrin, I did realize when GPT-4 first came out in the kind of early halcyon days, I had just recently done a placeholder module description for a module that I was going to be teaching, but we didn't really know anything about it other than the title. And I'd spent probably, 40 minutes or something putting it together. And actually, to be really fair, because placeholder module descriptions are completely generic documents, I did put a prompt into GPT-4 to see what it would come up with, and it was at least as good as what I'd done, and it took several seconds. It turns out I'm bad at generic bullshit.
Yes, you're apparently so. But to give everyone a bit of a grounding in why we're talking about this today is essentially, I have seen, and both you have seen, Matt, and I'm sure you listening at home have seen, tattoo artists or people who aren't artists who like tattoos have been using quite a lot of these like large language image generation either tools or sites to like generate tattoo flash. And I've seen now a handful of actual tattoos on people that are very noticeably the original stencil was designed by an AI model. And I think it's, a lot of people in tattooing, and myself included, kind of abhor it as this kind of transgression of like the beautiful spirit of tattooing, of creativity, all this sort of thing. But I think it would be better for us to have a very kind of like open and honest discussion about, AI and also other digital tools and its kind of interaction with tattooing. So, Matt, where do you want to start us?
Well, okay, I guess I want to talk a bit about some of the kind of ethical issues about authorship in a bit. But I guess, so yeah, look, where I want to start, man, is on a discussion about like what really we're talking about when we talk about AI and large language models and things like that. And I'm really guided on this by a book that I read after seeing a lecture by its author, a guy called Professor Alan Blackwell from the University of Cambridge. He's a long-time computer scientist, been working on AI practically and theoretically since the 1960s. he's just written an amazing book, which I really recommend people read, called Moral Codes: Designing Alternatives to AI. That came out on MIT Press. You can find it online on his website and download it for free. It's open access and Creative Commons license, but you can pick up the paperback version. It's really, really good. The book is great. Moral Codes. It basically is a kind of critique of AI from within, really, right, from inside the project. Like, as the blurb on the back of the book says, Alan Blackwell argues there's a fundamental flaw in the research agenda of AI. What humanity needs is better ways to tell computers what we want them to do. I was really struck by, so he gave a talk at my university about AI and creativity, which is one of the themes in Moral Codes. And he gave basically 3 metaphors to explain like what AI was, and therefore really why it was bad for creativity, or why it couldn't be creative in the sort of straightforward sense. So he says, like, there are 3 ways to understand what AI, large language model AI, does, right? And when I say AI, we were talking about large language model AI here, right? There's lots of other forms of AI which are not so morally problematic, but he says, right, the three things that the way to think about large language model AI is as follows. He says, number 1 is LLMs are a mechanical Turk. Now, you know what the mechanical Turk is, Tom?
Yes, and to explain it, essentially, it was this fake machine that was made to look like, oh, we have created a robot of a Turk that can play chess. And what would happen is people would go in and play it. And essentially, when you moved your piece, it would drop a magnet within the box that the chessboard was sitting on. And there was actually someone inside the box, and they would be moving strings to like make the Turk move a chess piece to play against you. So it is on the surface it looks like an autonomous automaton, but in reality there's a person inside of it. We've seen this quite often with, you can see the autonomous delivery drones in America that like go along the footpath. A lot of those are actually being driven by people in Southeast Asia.
Right. So the mechanical Turk was from the 18th century. It like beat Napoleon at chess. Most people knew it was a magic trick, or I think there's a lot of sort of pseudo history which sort of says, oh, people didn't know it and thought. I think most people knew it was a carny trick, but nevertheless, so a lot of modern AI is literally that. It's people behind the curtain, so to speak. There was another case in the US, a big company that claimed that their AI could build you any software you wanted, but it turned out it was just an office full of underpaid developers in India at the other end. But what Blackwell's talking about is a bit more subtle than that, which is that what large language models like ChatGPT do is they have the training data, the text of other people, basically, and then the transformer model algorithmically reconstructs it. So anything that comes out of it comes somewhere originally from a human being. So the machine isn't really doing anything creative. It's other than shuffling things together, and that comes to some of his second 2 metaphors. But the point is that this first metaphor in the mechanical Turk model, right? Like, even when we're not talking about literal underpaid, coders and others in the third world behind the AI models, even with the sort of the purely algorithmic computer generated stuff, the material inside it comes from human beings somehow. So all it really is doing, in some sense, is adding a layer of obfuscation, and it looks like magic, right, to viewers and credulous believers, but ultimately, like, there's a human in there somewhere whose role is obscured and hidden. And there's actually quite a lot of interesting historical work on the mechanical Turk that theorizes that because the machine required people to be very small, that probably a lot of the chess playing geniuses were actually women who weren't allowed to play chess publicly. So that's number 1 metaphor, right? Like, AI is bad on that front because it occludes the humanity within it. And if you want the information just goes straight to the source rather than relying on this weird fucking Rube Goldberg machine to give you the stuff. The second metaphor that he gives is of a tarot card. Now, of course, like tarot cards have human creators, the individual cards themselves, as well as the sort of systems that comes from it. There is creativity in the creation of individual tarot decks and the system of tarot per se, but the way that tarot divination works generally in modern Western iterations is that the meaning, if you like, comes from the viewer, right? So we are biologically, evolutionarily, and socially like pattern-seeking, meaning-seeking creatures. And the way that AI works, says Blackwell, in this way, is that what the machine spits out to you is not inherently meaningful. Where there is seeming novelty, where there is seeming innovation, where there is seeming creativity, the creativity is actually coming from you, the human being, who's interpreting these symbols in a novel way, rather than coming from a kind of intelligent creativity that's producing it, right? So the meaning of the outputs of LLMs in this sense is like the output of a tarot card. It has a kind of socially referent framework, but like it doesn't actually mean anything. Almost like a psychic reading as well, right? Like you, the audience, are finding meaning in these sort of often quite bland and quite kind of generic things. You're inscribing personal meaning to them, and I think we're seeing a lot of that happening in recent days, like the really awful stories about some of the things that people are getting into. I don't want to trigger anybody. So that's the second model. And then the third, I think, is the most interesting, perhaps, for what we're talking about today. So we've got the Mechanical Turk, we've got the tarot card. Then he says the third way to understand LLMs is like lasagna, right? And this is the weirdest one, obviously, and perhaps the one that needs a bit more description. So let me just read to you directly what he says here. Right. So this is Blackwell directly. So he says, the uncreative use of elements from existing artwork to create new ones already has a name in art criticism: pastiche. The term comes from the Italian cooking term pasticcio, meaning a bunch of different ingredients mixed into a single dish. Italian-speaking friends tell me that a lasagna would be a classic example of a pasticcio. Pastiche artwork originated long before mechanical reproduction, when people liked to decorate the walls of their homes with visual art but could not afford to hire skilled artists. Instead, a decorator would imitate and mix up elements of popular artworks, creating visual material that filled the walls but did not involve a great deal of creative consideration or artistic coherence. The result might be a pleasant alternative to plain walls, but would never be exhibited in the gallery or even lead to anyone remembering the name of the painter responsible. Such decorations might be comforting enough, just as it is when I buy a pre-made lasagna from a supermarket. However, just as when I buy a pre-made lasagna from a supermarket, I would be disappointed to be served such a standard mixture in an expensive restaurant run by a celebrity chef. After these humble origins, the term pastiche became more widespread amongst art critics and teachers, used to describe any work that imitates a particular style or artist by using familiar elements but without any clear original message other than possibly an affected stance of look who I'm pretending to be. In the classical definition quoted by art historians, a pastiche is something neither original nor a copy. In fact, that formulation of being neither original nor a copy seems very appropriate to describe the output of an LLM. In artistic terms, the output of an LLM could almost be taken as a definitive example of pastiche. Right. So basically, to summarize that, LLMs are like lasagna because they don't have any inherent history. Like lasagna is a kind of mix of loads of different things that we like individually: pasta, cheese, meat, yum, 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 yum. But it has no kind of deep authenticity of its own. It's not some, it's a creation meant to make us feel good, meant to feel like something authentic, and it's enjoyable in the moment, right? It may even be good for us and nourishing in some small way, but it's not really real. It's a simulacrum somehow, right? And like neither original nor a copy. It's something in between, something uncanny.
Well, this is exactly the point that I was I was about to make, is that like all this kind of exists in that space where it still contains enough of a reference to the original to be recognizable, but it is still distinctly different from it.
That's it. So for me, right, that explanation, and I immediately went up and shook his hand, and I bought the book, and I maybe we can get him on the podcast because he did have some interesting things to say about the potential utilization of this for tattooing. He was quite interested to learn when I mentioned to him that people were getting AI generated tattoos on him. But that for me was the real penny drop moment. I was like, oh yeah, like that really clears up to me something that is a lot more profound. So I don't know, like with that framework in mind, like, the Mechanical Turk, i.e. there's some humanity in there somewhere, but it's occluded. The tarot card, if there is anything good or joyous or beautiful, it's actually in the viewer, not in the producer. And with the lasagna, that this is a kind of slop that resembles art of a certain kind, but isn't really. Like, where do you think that? Where does that provide a starting point for what you wanted to talk about in terms of AI in tattooing?
Well, I think it's actually it is a little bit of a combination of all three, in the sense when it comes to AI art, I believe in general, well, I don't believe that it is art. I think what it is it, like you said, it is slop, kind of a mishmash of inputs like shoved together in order to create this output. I think the thing with tattooing that I think is very interesting is that, like, I've seen the argument, and people have made this argument towards me, that what difference does it make if so many people are already copying pre-existing designs? And what I countenance to that always say, even though someone might be copying, a Burke Grimm or a Sailor Jerry or an Ed Hardy design, there is still an element of the artist who is replicating it in their own design. There is still that human element that, intentionally or otherwise, there is an element of their own creativity in the design. And what AI does, and this is also, I think, something that I'll touch on a bit later in the episode, also it is a labor issue, is what it does is it extracts any kind of influence of creativity into the replication of the design, that someone, even if they're, copying a super, super classic, Sailor Jerry Swallow, there will still be small elements in it. And right. I think for us as people interested in tattoo history, it presents.
You've read my PhD thesis, Tom.
I think there is well, you know what they say, there's no such thing as an original thought. But what I think is interesting in the sense of, like, it makes it harder for us as people interested in tattoo history, because you, I, other, people who are tattooists or other enthusiasts, you can look at a design that someone has done in 2025 and you can trace almost the visual language of its history of how it arrived to that point. Like, you can kind of look and say, oh, they've pulled this from this place and that place and that place. And it's like, either there is an intentional choice done in that, or it is an amalgamation by someone's own creativity to arrive at that point. And what it is with AI that I kind of detest is that instead of it either being an unconscious thing through creativity or an intentional choice, all it is ripping every book off the shelf and just throwing it in a pot and seeing what comes out. There's no, like, consideration to, one, what it's referencing, and two, what its output is. And there is a very, very, very popular tattoo artist on TikTok who I won't name because he's a massive prick, who is very clearly using AI prompts for the base layer of a lot of his large compositions. And I find it, well, this guy is cheapening the art form in and of itself through his other business practices. You can probably figure out who I'm talking about, but I think it cheapens the art form. And yeah, I think there will always be people who will want a bit of a shortcut. And at the moment with the economy, I think a lot of people are struggling to balance, the labor costs of having to design a lot of this art and tattoo it in exchange for, the money they're going to get. So some people might look at it as a shortcut and might make life a little bit easier. But if life was meant to be easy, we'll all just, sit in the chairs from WALL-E.
Well, so I think you've really fucking hit on some good stuff there, man. I didn't, I guess, realize when we started talking about this that this is going to become a kind of, art theory lecture, but here we go. Like, I mean, the first thing to say, this is come and study art history with me and get hours and hours of stuff on this. I think like the first thing to say, actually, the first thing you've hit on there, right, is that a lot of the kind of lazier critique of AI that I've seen online is this question of authorship, and tattooers should be quote unquote original and blah blah blah, right? That's the top line, I think, thing you see people saying on YouTube and TikTok and Reddit about AI, right? But of course, as you pointed out, like, copying is a huge part of the history of tattooing, right? Tattooing is a kind of conservative with a small c art form, sometimes with a big C, actually, but certainly I mean here as graphically, it's a conservative art form. It's a folk art, and folk arts are very conservative. Images persist over centuries. Some of the designs that we still see as popular in tattooing today, in Western tattooing today, the pierced hearts and the roses, we can trace back to the 17th century, maybe even the 16th century, right? These are Milton Zeiss and George Burchett and Percy Waters and Joe Hartley and all these people that were selling tattoo equipment kits and how-to kits in the 19th century and early 20th century, like, a big part of their pitch, particularly of Zeiss, actually, was like, you don't have to know how to draw to be a tattooer. Tattooing, one of the reasons that Flash became a thing, as we talked about before, is that it allowed you to be a tattooer without being able to draw. And so I think the critique of like, tattooing's shit now because everyone's using AI, and that means the creativity's gone, is missing something important. Like, I think you're completely right there, dude. Like, the problem with AI in terms of authorship is not the kind of quote unquote laziness of it, because as I joke, but I did write a whole chapter of my PhD thesis about this. Like, copying is itself a creative act, right? Like, without getting too nerdy, the philosopher Gilles Deleuze wrote a whole book on this called Difference and Repetition, right? That the act of copying is itself an act of creating difference, and there is something political about the act of copying, like, and contingent, right? By which I mean, like, as you said, like, what are you copying it from? How are you copying it? What decisions are you making in how you're, in terms of tattooing, how you're shading it, what needles you're using? The same, we all know the same Flash design will look different in the hands of every artist who tattoos it, depending on their personal training, their skill, their preferences, their choices, and on the customers, right? So the act of copying per se is not what the problem with AI is, really, which means we have to get to something deeper. Yeah, sorry.
And a point I wanted to make as well is, like, with the element of creativity, someone made this argument with me. It was like, well, if the person still has to tattoo it on the body, it fundamentally doesn't necessarily change the act of tattooing and the end result of the tattoo. And I said that, well, look, I see that argument, but what we're then looking at is a kind of ship of Theseus argument that, like, how much of the process of being a tattooer, of getting a tattoo, can we change and replace before it's something else entirely? Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that, so I've been thinking about that too, actually, because I think there are a few, so tattooing's not the only one. I can think of some others, like cooking, chef, culinary arts, for example, or architecture, where there's going to be a kind of AI basis and then it has to be transformed into something material. And in a way, right, like, as I always say, tattooing is an index of its moment in time, like all art is. And in fact, if we're living in a world where the image world we live in is artificially generated, it's no surprise that the kind of real world begins to reflect that, and the tattoos begin to reflect that. But as you said, I think the issue then becomes like what you talked about, which is that there's some kind of ethical and coherently visual problem in the three things we just talked about in this pastiche, tarot, Mechanical Turk stuff, is that it's not just like as you said, you're not just taking the drawing that was originally done by Sailor Jerry or Owen Jensen or Percy Waters or, Ed Hardy or whoever it might be, and applying it, you're sort of outsourcing that or delegating it or hiding it. Actually, importantly, you're like occluding it, hiding it, like deburring it and taking away the humanity of it. And so I think it is interesting in a way, like conceptually, that these digital images are becoming enfleshed, but like it does so in a way that kind of, as I said, the problem isn't just you're just copying. It's something kind of more ethically, richly more complicated. I mean, the other thing to say as well, right, is that about the point you make about history. Have you read Pierre Bourges's Don Quixote?
Yes.
The story of that. Yeah. So for listeners, Borges is a Argentinian, I think, am I right? Like poet and theorist, a very interesting writer. Has many kind of interesting thought experiments about the nature of creativity, including famously the Infinite Library, which also gets trotted out by a lot of digital thinkers about the digital world. But,
yes.
He wrote a great essay called Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, right? And as we know, Pierre Menard is not the author of Quixote. Don Quixote was written by the Spanish author Cervantes in the 17th century, I think. Pierre Menard's a creation of Borges for this story. And the story basically goes that Menard seeks to write the story of the Quixote, and it ends up being word for word exactly the same as the original. And when he's criticized for this, he says, look, writing this Don Quixote in the 17th century is inevitable, right? Like it's a story of its time. Writing it in the 20th century is difficult, right? Because it's decontextualized. and the point, I mean, this is the point. I mean, Deleuze, I think, talks about this as well. And I talk about it in my PhD thesis chapter on this issue of originality as well, right? Is that the act of copying is something out of time. It gets called, like, you see this a lot with criticism of appropriation art in general, like people like Richard Prince and Sherry Levine, who do what's called rephotography. And people say, oh, it's just lazy. And it's not lazy, because the creativity, the power, the meaning is in this act of detemporalization, right? It's not as technically difficult as writing a story or taking a photograph, composing a photograph from scratch, but it doesn't need to be, right? And I think the point here is that when we talk about, I don't want to, I think what I've been saying over the last 5 minutes could be misread as saying AI is just the same as Flash, right? And actually, no. The point of Flash is that, as you said, it has a historical lineage. And, as I say in my PhD thesis, like getting 1940 sailor tattoos in 2005, like has a particular meaning. Like it's the act of copying itself is historically contingent. What I'm choosing to copy, who I'm choosing to copy, the changes that have been made to it, all of that. It's not quote unquote just copying. There's a kind of meaning in the act of copying, right? Whereas, and it's not even pastiche, because pastiche is sort of, or it's not necessarily pastiche. But what AI is doing, the problem with it is not its copying. It's its decontextualization. It's anti-historicism. Like the fact that it's not quote unquote original isn't really the problem. In fact, this is the point again of that metaphor that Blackwell uses about lasagna. It's neither original nor copy, and it's kind of ambiguity that's the problem, and that's one reason why it's so uncanny.
And one thing I want to say as well is that, like, we had previously done an episode about Pinterest and the influence of algorithmically pushed tattoo designs and how that affects both artists and customers. And I think this is like in that episode we specifically talked about how one single design of it's a split half and half. It's meant to be a wolf and a wolf's skull. The skull is actually a raccoon because wolves don't have front-facing canine teeth, and it looks better in a design typically like on a flat surface if the teeth are pointing forward. And what happened is
one image on Pinterest was tagged wrong, right?
Yeah, one image on Pinterest was tagged wrong, and then over time that got worked into the visual lexicon for a lot of tattooers of like, this is what this design looks like. Someone will come in and ask for it. I know what it looks like. And because there is a kind of a chain of causation that we could trace back to that original image being tagged wrong, we can understand the path that was taken from A to B. And what AI does through massive data scraping and using inputs to kind of mash all these things together to try and, as accurately as possible, create an output that matches that prompt. What it does is it completely destroys that like pathway to finding where things are from. And it's like, have you ever seen the image of this is what a stroke looks like?
No.
I'll send it to you. So it was a very common meme a few years ago on Twitter and Instagram and whatever. And it's essentially, you can look at this image and you can't make out a single object in it. Like, you can't figure out what any of this stuff is.
Right.
And I think of a lot of this like algorithm or AI generated stuff like that. It's similarly, you can always tell when something's AI generated when it comes to like somewhat realistic things, because it almost has like this Gaussian blur on it because it can't render stuff in enough detail for it to, you know, be really, really highly detailed and clear. And it's the same way like when, you know, people say, when you put in a prompt that says like, oh, make something anime style, it just looks like Studio Ghibli, because there has been so much input into these machines to make that output that it has essentially poisoned the language at which it speaks to itself to create these outputs. But aside from that, a thing that I really want to talk about is like the relationship to labor and how this affects it. And when I was thinking about doing this episode, I thought of something that was analogous in that like the original four elements of hip hop is that, like, you know, b-boying, MCing, DJing, and graffiti. And it's, you know, looking at tattooing as a art form, it is a kind of a holistic practice that takes in a lot of these different elements of, you know, research and drawing and creating and like tattooing in and of itself, and also running a business, which is, you know, a big element of as well. It's like the actual endpoint of the tattooing is only one component part of it. And to come back to the Ship of Theseus argument, or I suppose comment that I made earlier, I think the thing that's concerning for me is like, I think a lot of people are like really feeling the pinch right now, and, you know, times are difficult for tattooers. People are kind of like, I need to do something. I need to do something different. And rather than,
so,
yeah, go on.
I mean, the point you make about hip hop's really interesting, because again, like Blackwell talks about that in as well, right? I mean, his point, which I think you're getting to too, is this idea about like creativity, which is that if you mix things together that already exist, that's one thing, but it needs something else to push it into novelty. Otherwise, it's just kind of, you know, boring. I mean, he says,
before we go forward, you know, do you want to explain the three N's in relation to art?
Yeah, novelty, nuance, and narrative, right, are these three ideas. The story, the iteration, and the kind of, you know, care in which it's produced. In terms of hip hop, right, like Blackwell says, technological art forms like hip hop rely fundamentally on the remixing of other recordings for rich cultural references. The music industry does not necessarily help with bureaucratic policing of copyright to maximize revenue for record companies, rather than encourage creative adventure for either artists or audiences. If we think about the significance of creative work in the attention economy, the most interesting aspect of remix is the amount of attention invested by the remixer, involving many hours of careful listening, in contrast to simultaneously mechanical operations of streaming and copying. A sampling art provocateur like John Oswald creates their work not by stirring together predictable elements, but through attentive reading of the original work in order to mold and transform something new. Which is why, right, like my favorite tattooers in the world at the moment, people like Taku Oshima is a good example of this. Gakin, I'm not just picking Japanese blackwork artists, who are Skila Tattooer is another one. Like, even what Ed was doing back in the 90s is that you're not just kind of abjectly mixing together stuff. You're actually finding you're sort of selecting the things that you're remixing, and you're making it into something that's still comprehensible to your audience, that has a kind of anchor historically, even while creating something new. Like, I think Dan Higgs is such a good example of that too. Bob Roberts, all of that crew that Ed assembled around Tattoo City. And I thought it was really interesting. Like, Blackwell's is a music guy, and he makes a lot of references to hip hop, but he also has this idea of like sort of informational surprise, right? Which is like this idea taken from informational theory that basically says like, what we want is not incoherent data. We want data that is familiar in the right way, but is surprising. And what AI cannot be, inherently at least, is surprising. And he says, really, the better it gets, the better these LLMs get, as you said, in kind of replicating perfectly what the prompt is, the less surprising they get. In fact, that's part of the iterative goal of the models, is that these companies don't want their products to be surprising. They want them to be, correct. And in fact, there's obviously reasons to do that. We don't want generative AI to kind of hallucinate things if we want facts from them. But maybe we do want hallucinations if what we want from AI is not.
Well, what I was going to say is like tattooing as a art form, I think, is both an artistic but also a semantic conversation with the past, and it is
right. That's it. That's a great way of putting it.
Look, and it is, large language models are completely incapable of semantic understanding, and it is why you see so many people essentially now suffering from induced psychosis because of like heavy use of these stuff like ChatGPT, and it is completely incapable of like having a non-surface level understanding of what it is observing. You say, I want a Ed Hardy style dragon wearing an American football helmet, and it will take that extremely literally. Whereas if you said it to a tattoo artist, they will have a semantic understanding of what you are asking them for, but also a semantic and artistic understanding of what you are referencing, and then how they can take that prompt, if you want to use the language of an AI model, take that prompt that you have given them and then create a cohesive output of what you want, but also understanding what you mean.
Yeah, and mean semantically as well, but also mean visually. I mean, I'm really struck by, again, if you look at the discussions on Reddit about, quite often actually, and this is one of the, maybe this is your, to get onto your point finally about labor, I think a lot of the things that people seem to be annoyed about when you look on Reddit about AI and tattooing is that the use of AI is not disclosed to the customer. And so they get tattooed, and then people afterwards say, that's done by AI, my dude. And then the people are very upset by that. I mean, but what ends up happening is you end up with images that are visually incoherent. So there was the one that I sent you of someone who'd used AI to generate the line work for a tattoo based on a woodcut of a skeleton playing a bone violin, some kind of like 15th century woodcut. And the tattooer could have just traced it themselves, frankly, but didn't. And the end result was incoherent because the bones didn't join up properly, and the tattooer just didn't care. Like, it was just completely careless. There's another one that we spent a lot of time talking about a while ago, some anime character, I think from Last Airbender, who the AI had sort of rendered pretty well, but a lot of the coloring was kind of wrong, and just as you said, the kind of edges of it didn't quite work. And rather than looking at it properly, the tattooer just basically slavishly copied what the AI had served up to them. And then the customer was really pissed off about it because they didn't realize till afterwards that the tattoo that they wanted was the image was, even though it was tattooed by hand by someone who should have seen that they were coloring in, bits of it wrong or doing too many fingers or whatever the case might be. They completely outsourced their fucking brains to the machine. And this comes, I see this a lot in defenses amongst even my own students, right? For using it, who use AI occasionally, and I say, "Oh, I'm just using it to brainstorm, or I'm just using it to give me an outline," right? And I think, sadly, creepingly, that's becoming a bit of an accepted narrative where it's okay to use AI for that, but not to produce the final product. But I think when you use AI to create your outline, whether it's a real outline of a tattoo or the outline of an essay or something, what you're doing is you're sort of baking in these problems, like ethically and semantically and comprehensively into the final product. Like, I see this all the time where students say, "Oh, I just used it for an outline, or I just used it to brainstorm," and it's like, well, you've gone wrong from the very fucking beginning, right? Like, you've made the wrong step right from the start. And I think, there certainly is a school of thought now of I see online in these threads. I think most people seem to be quite morally hardened about AI, against AI use in tattooing, but the defenders of it will say, well, they'll say, I'm just using it to generate compositional ideas, or I'm just using it to save me time in producing line work. Like, I'm still, like, it's a tool. That's really what it is, isn't it? It's this metaphor that AI is a tool, and I hate that. I hate that when people say that. And I've got a very, very good friend who works for a big software company. Really, really, really the smartest guy I know. Like, incredible software developer. And he sort of said that to me, and I was like, you don't, like, of all people, dude, like, you do not need this quote unquote tool.
Mm-hmm.
And
this is where it dovetails into go on.
Yeah, sorry. Again, just to quickly quote Blackwell again, right? Like, scholars should attend to how software is built and used today, attributing responsibility to the tool user rather than the tool, and probably not spending too much time discussing the plots of science fiction novels, right? The idea that, this is just a tool, I think is a step to start with, right? He, as Blackwell says, tools can be dangerous if used in the wrong ways, but tools offer a space for participation, creativity, and debate. If a company starts selling machines that are dangerous or harmful, there's little point in regulating screwdrivers. A more effective response is to ensure that more people know how these tools could be used, so alternatives are clear. Furthermore, when these are knowledge tools rather than physical ones, the tools themselves can be designed in a way that offer opportunities for open participation and debate about what is being created. So he says, like, the AI products that exist are not tools. We could perhaps build tools that use AI technology, but what we've got at the moment, people think they're tools, but they're not. And this is probably I think kind of what you're trying to get at, right?
Yeah. So what I was going to say is I think this really perfectly dovetails into the point I want to make about labor, in the sense of, like, do you remember the arguments about, like, tattoo artists using iPads? And I think now we are past that point where it's like, iPads are making people worse tattooers. I think we recognize that, like, they are tools to be used, but they are an accompaniment to an already existing skill set. Like, you need to be able to draw at some level, to draw on Procreate, and it's also a separate skill then to tattoo that design on skin. Yes, there are tools within stuff like Procreate, such as like line matching, so things can be perfectly symmetrical, and I think there is an element of skill in doing that has been lost through the use of iPads. Not completely, but a lot of people necessarily might not know how to make something extremely symmetrical in a design on paper. But what the iPad, different to this, is that the iPad didn't completely replace a skill set. What it did was it modified it in a sense that you are still drawing stencils, just in a different medium, with slightly different tools. And what AI is doing instead is that, like, it is completely either removing a required skill set, or it is modifying it to the point of where it doesn't resemble the original skill in and of itself that is required to undertake this art form. And I think also, as well, the economic pressures that tattoo artists are under at the moment, I think it can be tempting for people to use these because, like you said, oh, it saves time. It saves time. It means I can do more tattoos in a day, which I think is a bit of a moot point, because every tattoo artist that I talk to, just socially, is like, I wish I was busier. There isn't clients coming through the door to justify the amount of time you're saving through, using AI. And I think a counter argument to that would be, spending your time developing skills that are like unique to you in a competitive industry that has so many people in it, that you need to stand out. That's how you stand out, is working on a craft and a skill to the point of where it's truly unique to you. And AI undermines that. And in a similar way that AI is being used to replace human labor in other industries, we talked before about, tattooing robots. What happens when, they don't need to license those designs from artists anymore? And it's like, oh, this is a, Tattoo Bot 5000 and all of its designs are AI generated and no human is involved in that process other than the person sitting in the chair. What happens then?
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded as you say that about the other episode we did recently about stencils, right? Which is, again, somehow back to this idea of copying, which is that, and this is still true on the iPad, right? Even as you're using an iPad to like create a line work stencil over a referenced photograph you've downloaded from the internet or whatever, you're still somehow getting to understand the construction of that tattoo by the movement of the pen in your hand, right? One of the things that I think is happening is people are auto-generating stencils. And of course, it's a trick that goes back, again, to the days of Sailor Jerry, who used to put like false lines into his drawings so that you couldn't bootleg them. Because if you just copied them, they have mistakes in them. They were like little what get called in more traditional media mount weasels, right? Like to stop copying of like phone directories and maps. Companies used to put in fake names and fake addresses, and fake towns even, so that if a competitor produced a product and it had their fake data in it, they'd know it was copied, because you can't copyright information. Sailor Jerry used to do that occasionally with his line work. If you bought them directly from him, you'd get the real ones. But if in the you get the kind of cheat sheet. But the one that was just available to everybody had mistakes in it. And like, if you're not learning, even when you're drawing the flash by hand, like or creating the stencil even by hand, you're not learning how the image is constructed. And I think a lot of the weirdness that is happening with these AI generated tattoos is exactly that. People are using it to kind of quote unquote save time, but what they're doing in the process is not the first time they're ever drawing that shape with their hand, is when they're using a machine on skin and they don't understand how these things are constructed. So that's how you end up with, that bone skeleton thing, like, because you're not looking at what you're doing and you're not understanding the construction of the image from its bones upwards. And I think, we've had criticisms about iPads taking away that kind of, link between the ink in the skin and the ink in paper that came from early Flash. Like we talked about that in our History of Flash episode. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of iPad generated designs look weird is because things that work on paper and ink in skin don't transfer to digital to skin. Things that look good on a flat iPad screen don't work as cleanly necessarily all the time without a real understanding of what you're doing. But yeah, like what AI is doing, it's sort of severing that link between you and the source in a way that isn't present in other kind of digital technologies as prominently, right?
And one thing as well, I think maybe as a final thought I want to hit on is, and this is, a argument centering around like the use of AI, but also, CGI in stuff like cinema, people using it in more contemporary forms of art, and it's particularly in music. And, they're like, well, why does it matter if the end product is kind of indistinguishable from something made by a human and it, people enjoy it regardless? And I have been a very staunch proponent of the thought that I think over the past 40 years we've seen a kind of a dismantling of an appreciation for art in general, and what we have replaced it with is entertainment. That instead of, seeing and engaging with a piece of art as a meaningful piece of art, it is just solely viewed as a piece of entertainment. And I think AI is unfortunately the poison in the well that furthers that argument more than anything else, because what it does is it strips away the human element to have a relatively similar enough end product. And when people are focused solely on like the entertainment value of something as consumers, they completely miss the transient elements of art that like make it something meaningful. I know this is not necessarily a qualitative statement like of something being good. I think there's lots of bad art that I think is still valuable as a form of art. But I kind of loathe to think about, something that, tattooing, something that I care about so much, and tattooing as a art form being treated with the same kind of consumer entertainment mentality that allows, something to come in that completely devalues the work of people that I care about, and lots of people that I've never met and probably never will. We've always encouraged people on this show to have a more meaningful relationship with tattooing, but art in general. And I think one of the most meaningful ways you can do that is just a wholehearted rejection of like AI generated art being, worked into it.
100%. And I think, again, I want to keep coming back to Blackwell because he sums up something really similar in the conclusion to his book, right? Where he says, how do we design software that will let us spend the hours of our lives more meaningfully, attentively conscious, and creative moral agents rather than being condemned to bullshit jobs while the machines pretend to be human? My simple answer is we need better programming languages and less AI. Other commentators on AI have emphasized the need for new legal policies, removal of bias, transparency of algorithms, improved data rights and sovereignty, explanation of algorithmic decisions, and so on. All of those would be helpful, and excellent books on those topics have been published. But improved access to programming can support them all. In this project, I've tried to emphasize lessons of history, especially principles of human-centric design that have remained important across generations of technical approaches and different kinds of representational code. Basically, I love that phrase of like, we need software that allows us to spend the hours of our lives more meaningfully, attentively conscious, and creative moral agents, right? Essentially, this is exactly the point you're making, right? Which is that there's a kind of outsourcing of humanity to AI, and the focus on it's just copying, or even, environmental aspects we haven't talked about, and they are of course really relevant. Like, AI is awful because it uses fucking insane amounts of water and electricity, but for our purposes for this podcast, the concerns are exactly those that you just point out, which is that there's a kind of humanity about this, and what it does is it produces a kind of incoherence. And one of the important things about tattooing for me is not that it's meaningful in a narrative sense, right? People sort of say, what does that tattoo mean? And they mean, what's the kind of narrative story about it? But for me, and we talked about this loads on the podcast, and it's been in some senses the core of my work over the last 20 years, is like, meaning for art history is not individual decodable meaning in the Da Vinci Code sense, iconological meaning, if you like. It's meaning for the cultural moment, right? For the people that made it and saw it. And what AI does is break that connection. It still has meaning in an art historical sense, in that we can kind of read that disconnection as indexical of something happening in culture, like, of course. But what the AI creativity is doing, right, is, or AI generation of tattoo images doing, is it's removing the link, as you said, between history and humanity and the finished product. And it's not a problem of copying, right? Because, as we said, copying is an inherent part of tattooing. It's not even really about laziness, so to speak, even though we should be, critical of that too. It's something kind of deeper, as you point out. It's something kind of, it's something uncannily, ethically, like, unsettling
It ends.
I want tattooing, even where the designs are reproduced. I want it to be human, and for me, like, that's the most beautiful, important thing about tattooing, right? Is its humanity. And again, I've written about that extensively, and what AI does, even though there's still a human being at the other end, and I suspect there probably are interesting ways to use AI politically in art and in tattooing, but the way that most people are doing it is not that.
Mm-hmm. And it ends that semantic and it ends that semantic and artistic and in a way pedagogic like conversation with the past in tattooing as an art form. And I think in art in general, it's like it's essentially trying to have a conversation with a brick wall, and it cannot like in a semantic sense, in that like it cannot understand the contextual meanings of what it's being asked in terms of designs. In an artistic sense, it will make something, you could argue is weird and unique, but isn't, in line with that semantic conversation. And in a pedagogic sense, it's like there's nothing it can teach us, and there's nothing it can hand down. And tattooing is a art form that is so deeply and heavily relies on the passing down of this knowledge from one person to another, to another, to another. And if you want to hear a complete flip side of this argument, go listen to the episode we did with, Aaron,
Danny,
about, the recent discovery on the Pazyryk mummies. Like, that is a semantic, artistic, and pedagogic conversation with the past that they are having through their work. And it's completely antithetical to everything we've talked about here today. But, I hope, we didn't come across like too hectoring, or this was like a lecture, but this is, I think it's an important conversation to have. And, we're seeing the active replacement of, Googling something as a verb with ChatGPTing. And,
I mean, like,
the best thing you can do is go, pick up a book and learn something, or, at best search for it online, not using AI.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe I can give the last word to Blackwell, because again, he sums this up really nicely. He says, as we've explained, I explained that many recent demonstrations of AI involve little more than scraping, rearranging, and reselling the intelligent online work of other humans whose contributions are hidden inside a computational fancy dress. We've always found it entertaining when machines behave in human-like ways, even when these are magic tricks, right? However, there are dangers associated with these kind of entertaining technologies. Less serious danger is that AI experts downplay the difference between the two kinds of AI: objective mechanical tools and entertaining imitations of human subjectivity. This fallacy encourages magical thinking, in which future AI systems are imagined as being able to do everything a human can do and more. A more serious problem is that real people are doing the intelligent work behind the scenes, often with exploitative working arrangements or even working for free, while huge profits are being made by people who are not doing the basic labor. Real hours of conscious attention are dedicated to training the machine, turning original thoughts and words into aggregated components. Perhaps the world's always been this way, and it would be overly idealistic to argue for anything else. But the dangerous fiction of AI is the machine is doing this work all by itself, and that no humans are involved, and thus no one deserves to be recognized and more fairly compensated to receive a share of the profits being made. I feel like that's a really nice summary, right? That there are at least two things happening when we talk about AI. There's the kind of magic trick of like, oh, look, it's made an image. Wow. And we all enjoy that. But then there's the kind of, as you said, Tom, there's this kind of darker, like, hollowness underneath it, which occludes what's going on. And actually, if you want to, I don't know, if you want to do a tattoo of a skeleton playing a bone fiddle, you're better off like properly looking at the drawing a real human being did hundreds of years ago, rather than a kind of weird like funhouse mirror fucking river polluting plagiarism machine version of it, right? Which is still has the humanity in it, but is buried away. Like, why would you do that? Just why? And I'm going to try and explain this to my students when term starts. Like, why would you outsource your creativity, the one thing as Blackwell points out, the one thing that we have as human beings to a machine, whilst we carry on doing the bullshit work and let the machine do all the human stuff, it's dystopian and weird.
And with that, I want to thank all of you for listening, and thank you, Matt, for once again showing up on time. I was late. I have to say the AI Matt chat voice model worked really well. He made some great points in this episode. Hopefully we'll get the real Matt back next week. But yeah, thank you very much for listening, and it is goodbye for now. Bye.
Thank you. It's goodbye from me too.